Avery, whose show is this? And we're live. Welcome, everybody, here to the Lakers Lounge podcast. I'm Anthony Irwin, joined on this fine Tuesday, I guess like morning, your guys' time, early afternoon, mine, by Brian and Andy Kamenetzky, hosts of the Locked On Lakers podcast. They also do a ton of stuff for Spectrum and for ESPN Radio as well. I did Andy's Lakers show last week, so if you guys missed that, we'll just keep an eye out for all of those episodes. They've been really fun so far.
Thank you.
And yeah, today on the show we're going to be talking about all of the slop that ESPN dropped in Shams Charania's new piece. And this is the first leg of a home and home that the guys and I like to do from time to time. Lakers have a nice little break. We're going to take advantage of it by hopping on each other's show and filling air for a little bit. I want to start with this. This is like literally just happened. So Shams reported earlier this morning, quote, the Heat are open to listening to offers for Jimmy Butler, league sources told ESPN, and the six-time All-Star is believed to prefer a win-now contender in any trade. And then 11 minutes ago, Ira Winderman reported that Jimmy Butler left practice today without comment amid the ESPN report of possible Heat trade consideration. So, Brian, the one thing I feel like the Lakers are lacking is drama, right? Like that's.
Well, I mean, look, I there have been few guys like that I was sort of more wrong about in terms of like, you know, when he went from, was it from Minnesota, Chicago, or I forget how many steps back for Jimmy, but like of like how good he was and like the impact he could have, like he's
how long he would be around too.
But, you know, he's 35 and, you know, makes a ton of money. And I think the drama, when at least around Jimmy Butler, is going to be the idea that the Lakers, for those Lakers fans who are like, Jimmy Butler, it's Jimmy Butler, go get Jimmy Butler's biggest name that you're going to. Jimmy Butler is a bigger name than Dorian Finney-Smith, who I'm sure we're going to talk about in a moment. Go get him. Lakers can't go get him. So it's like the drama is going to be as why the Lakers are paralyzed in the Jimmy Butler sweepstakes when other teams are able to put something together.
Although for what it's worth, given how much money Butler makes in the new CBA and how complicated it makes it across the entire league for trades, I think there's going to be a lot of teams that appear, you know, as you put it, Brian, paralyzed when it comes to Butler. Like the idea that it's just going to become a seller's market for Jimmy Butler. I mean, regardless of what you think of Butler as a player, the idea that all of a sudden it becomes a seller's market for Riles and he can just field tons and tons of offers and just sift through the best one. There are going to be a lot of teams who can't do this even if they want to, like realistically.
That's the thing that I keep running into. And there was the report, actually, Wendy had it for ESPN, how he was like, Zach LaVine in a typical year, even with his albatross contract, would be traded for. Like somebody would line up and convince themselves, I can save him. And this is like, you look at the amount of money he's making, it's really tricky to try to make a trade happen for him. Because the other thing too is, all right, you send out 4 or 5 rotation guys to get to that number that you need to get to. And then you need to fill out the rest of your roster, and you might not have very much room to be able to do so. And then the opposite is true on the other end, where it's like, all right, you got back all of those players. Well, now you have a ton of work to do on your roster to make that your roster legal by the time that trade is actually executed. This new CBA has completely paralyzed the big contract motion, and it was by design. It was an effort to kind of tamper down temper down what the Ballmers of the world were able to do, what Laika was able to do, what Josiah was able to do, and in executing it and arriving here, we've now hit a point where nobody can do anything. And, you know, like,
well, I don't, nobody is structured yet there's still, most teams are still structured for the older setup.
Yeah.
And so it takes 2 or 3 years to cycle through to new contracts, and people structure them differently, and they're, everybody's giving out the same types of deals. We're not there yet. I mean, Jimmy he's this year a player option for next year that I'm going to go ahead and guess he's going to pick up for
56 mil.
Yeah.
That's next year. And then, and then he's a free agent after that.
Mm-hmm.
Would you rather have, I if I have to trade for one
52
of the two,
mil, I'm sorry.
for Zach LaVine.
52 mil,
million,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It feels like 51.
Right. It's barely a scratch over 49. But I think and plus the era, I think, of teams signing up to take on superstars in their early to mid 30s, I think is getting pretty near done. Like, it's one thing if you already have Joel Embiid and you just kind of have to sign him to that contract, and you just pray you get 1 year where he's healthy in the playoffs and it works out okay, but most of the time he's going to be hurt. I think people saying, oh yeah, give me the 35-year-old superstar. I guess Paul George is an exception to that, but I don't think we're going to see very much of that going forward.
Well, I actually think that Winderman report of Jimmy walking out of that practice is very kind of exemplary of what you're talking about here, where these stars have basically run the league, for the last, decade or so of their NBA lives. And we're arriving at a point here where they have like no power over their situation anymore compared to what they had before. And I think there's a lot of frustration going on there, and it's really kind of hitting ahead. We saw it with Paul George airing all of the negotiation between him and the Clippers, and talking about how he felt they lowballed him at the beginning of that process and never really arrived at a place that he was really comfortable with, and eventually went to Philly. And the Clippers just let Paul George walk. Like, I think you're hitting the nail on the head there, where there are all these names that are these household names, and we're hitting a point here where those household names are just kind of stuck, because they're either stuck or they're being told, like, no, this is the situation here, and we'll see what it comes of it. I'm
too, really quick,
for Butler to go to Denver.
Paul George ultimately moved in part as insurance to that investment with Joel Embiid that Brian was talking about before, where it's like, look, we can't, or you can, but most organizations will not move off somebody like Embiid, even with all the issues, because of the potential for upside. So you bring in a very inconvenient insurance policy in Paul George, even as you look at this going like, all right, this is at best a house of cards, and you just hope that you go 6 months without wind, 1 year. But if they did not have this situation with Joel Embiid, I seriously doubt in a vacuum the Sixers bring in Paul George. It's because they're trying to make the best out of what is increasingly turning into an awkward situation with them and Embiid. But there is still a fair amount of throwing good money after bad to some degree with this stuff. It's just, are you even in the position to throw that bad money out?
There's just not very much money to go around in this as Rob likes to call it, the apron world that we're all living in. Do you think, Brian, this is actually good for the league? Like, how complicated this is because on one hand, the league wanted to kind of, keep some players in their markets and make it easier to kind of for the fan bases to invest into that identity of having that star there and keeping that star there. But also, like, trade rumors, slop, that has become such a part of the league's fiber that just kind of yanking it out and pulling that rug out from under everybody. I'm not sure if that's necessarily great either.
To quote our friend Darius Soriano, yes and no.
Ooh, there he is.
I know here's where I think I don't like it. potentially punishes teams who do things well.
Yeah.
I know we don't like praising them in this corner of the basketball world, with Lakers fans, but the Celtics have done things
You could have
really
said the
well
Thunder. You could have
with
you
very
could.
smartly. I could have said the Thunder. I'm going to the Thunder as well. They're not there yet, but they're going to get there. There are a lot of teams who have just done smart things and built stuff in smart ways, and they shouldn't necessarily have to break it up just because it's not even that the bills get too high. Like, you know what? Your local hedge fund manager can decide whether or not they care about this or not. It's become so difficult to do anything.
Yeah.
Can't
Can't
draft
aggregate
someone,
players.
sign a minimum, like you can't do anything.
Yeah.
And so that part of it I don't like. Your other point, though, I mean, like the criticism of the league for a long time has been that nobody cares about the basketball. All they care about the rumors. All they care about. Well, okay, so then you have to set up a structure to where the rumors aren't the thing that drives the league, and it may not work for them very well. People may not. Maybe that's why we're seeing so much focus on too many 3-pointers now, or whatever it is. But you kind of can't have it both ways. You can't make it so the league is so dependent on the online rumor culture driving it, which I think I agree with, is sort of ultimately not a healthy way to run a league. But then also be like, well, but now they've made it so there are fewer deals for people to latch onto. That in theory should get them to watch the game more.
Yeah. In theory,
we'll see. Like it may not, but we'll see.
Mathematically, to this point, I don't think it's necessarily playing out that way. I don't know. Andy, do you think it's good or bad for the league? I think it just is right now.
Generally speaking, I think anything that gets in the way of creating great teams is not good for the league. When you think about the history of the NBA and what's had resonance and staying power, Showtime Lakers, Jordan Bulls, these new Warriors, the different incarnation of championship teams for Kobe, like that required the ability to maneuver and, sustained greatness in team, the Heatles, like sustained greatness of teams draws attention to the league. Like it gives you something to focus on. And while you want to make sure that, the big market leagues can't just completely Bigfoot their way through this. The flip side is any small market owner went into this knowing they're going to have an inherent disadvantage against the big market teams, either get into this or don't. And the idea, whether you're trying to safeguard small market teams against big market teams, or in some ways save owners from themselves and their own bad decisions, I think the more you put these type of limitations on the league, the worse it is in terms of creating the thing that creates the most attraction and attention in the first place. I also feel like the league should inherently look to make it easier for teams to retain their own guys and build around their own guys, or players that for all intents and purposes are their own guys. Like a Chris Middleton, not that he's at the level of like a Hall of Fame all-time great, but he has basically spent his entire career in Milwaukee other than one season. You should want to be able to create agency for the Giannis's and the Stephs and the Lukas, or Kobe, Duncan, Dirk back in the day. You should want to make it easier to create those type of one team superstars.
Yeah.
Because again, I think that is good for the league. Jokic right now with Denver, I think it is good for the league when you start associating players with one particular team.
Yeah, I've for basically as long as I've done this, I've always thought that the thing that the league needs to consider is, let's say they keep the max contract concept, and then, in the NBA now you have these super max contracts if you qualify for them. I think that gap between the max and super max shouldn't count against your cap, so that you allow that team to bring in more talent while retaining that
or if it's your own guy at the very least. Like
Yeah.
I feel like you should reward teams for doing things correctly. And if you are keeping a superstar in the fold for 7 years, 10 years, you're doing something right.
Yeah.
And you should be held up as an example for other franchises to learn from. So you start getting, especially if you're looking to cut down on player migration, then you should incentivize players wanting to stay where they are. And in order to do that, you want to make it so superstars have a reasonable ability to be built around. Otherwise, you're just sort of trapping them.
Yeah. Well, and the other inherent problem here is that like super teams, dynasty, stuff like that, that was such a part of the NBA's identity that now, because like basically what Adam Silver would prefer is that we exist in an NFL world where things are a lot more level, and in any given game you could see any team beat any team and all of that stuff. Problem there is that like basketball is a very different sport from football. Football is inherently random. That's why they don't play with the spherical ball. And two, one football player outside of the quarterback doesn't have the same impact as one basketball player does. And then, three, in the NBA, those dynasties are what drew casual fans to the sport. It's not like, no Lakers fan just tunes in for a Bucks Pistons game in the same way that like a Vikings fan will tune into a Thursday night game. It just doesn't happen. And this hope that like, all right, we're going to change all the rules and we're going to make everybody a little bit more mediocre and level out that playing field just so that just maybe we can get that kind of viewership. I just think I think the concept,
I think people talk about parity in the NFL either disingenuously or not really paying attention, because as much as there can be fluidity between which teams are better year to year, it has basically been Mahomes's and Brady's league for like a decade plus. Like those two guys have won the overwhelming majority of championships for over a decade. So you are creating some degree of parity during a regular season that has much more exclusivity and scarcity in terms of the amount of games. So it's easier to turn into an event anyway. But I mean, look at the Chiefs right now. They don't even look that good, and for some reason they keep winning.
But isn't that the idea? Isn't that the ideal? Like, you have a system where every year, like, you're a Vikings guy, Anthony. Like, nobody thought the Vikings were going to be good this year, especially after McCarthy got hurt in training camp. All of a sudden, they're great, and like, here's this team that is going to be totally, a fan base that's totally invested all year long. That is expected to be a really down year. If they get to the playoffs, maybe Jalen Hurts will knock them out. Maybe it'll be Mahomes. I don't know, but like, it doesn't matter if they get all the way through there because the regular season matters too. And so I think like what's happening,
it's also easier to do with 17 games.
Of course it is, but there's, I don't know if the NBA wants. I don't think they necessarily don't want. I don't think they care necessarily if the Celtics win 3 or 4 titles in a row. I think the question I have about all this stuff is like, it is a different universe than when the Celtics, were winning the Lakers in the 80s and then, Lakers again in the 2000s. And, the Spurs dynasty, is that something that really excited people? I mean, everybody talked about how boring they were. I think what you need is the huge criticism for the NBA is that the regular season is completely irrelevant.
Yep.
So, look at what's happening in the Western Conference right now. There are 12 teams. Even after they've expanded, however you want to define the playoffs, an opportunity to get in the playoffs, there are 12 teams in the West that are going to be able to be like, we can get in. And they're not doing it like Eastern Conference style where we're like 14 games under 500, but we're still only, 2.5 games out of the 8 spot.
But they can do something when they get there. Like those teams feel like if we just get there, just get us there.
I mean, Sacramento is probably the worst of those teams right now. Certainly record-wise, I think they are. Game under 500, whatever. But like, if you show up to the playoffs and you've got Sabonis, De'Aaron Fox, and DeMar DeRozan, like, you're not a crappy team. Like, you're not a team that anybody can just kind of take for granted and walk over. Those are 3 really good players, and so I think I think the league is in a bit of a bind in that you're trying to make your regular season relevant. And they've done that with the play-in, which has been, I think, a remarkable success. I think that's been great for the league. And I think the NBA Cup I don't think it's as exciting this year as last year, but it seems like it is going to be a thing that generates a little bit of interest from year to year, and stuff like that. I think it's stars. Like, you just have to, like, we're still stuck a little bit in that tweener phase where LeBron and KD and, Giannis is getting a little older, Steph, like, they're still the sort of the stars that move things around there, but they're not, Jokic doesn't have the same cachet, and, younger guy, I think they're trying to do that with Ant, and it's not totally working because he hasn't quite ascended in the way that, so I think it's really about stars more than it is teams and dynasties.
The other thing too is a lot of this is, at the end of the day, about shifting. And Anthony, you brought this up a little bit at the beginning of this conversation. A lot of this is just about shifting power back to owners as opposed to players, because the reality is the Showtime Lakers were a super team. The 80s Celtics were a super team. The Bulls were a super team. The difference is it was just the GMs and owners who essentially crafted those teams, as opposed to player migration forcing it. But the idea that the league somehow was more of a level playing field in the 80s is a joke. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, and it's why I lose patience sometimes when I hear some of the older players, particularly ones on those type of teams, talk about how, they would have never teamed up. It's like, you didn't have to. Like, you had everybody on your team. Like
the eighth best player on those Celtics teams is in the Hall of Fame.
Right. I mean, like, if Magic was truly that competitive, at some point he would have gone to Dr. Buzz and said, you know what, trade worthy. Like, this is too easy. I want a new challenge.
In the Hall of Fame for those
teams.
Teams.
I mean, like, these super teams have always existed. I think a lot of the sticking point is how they come about happening. And that's where a lot of this ends up taking place.
But that's also the era that the NBA took off, was with those super teams. And again, like, I just, the biggest question I have facing,
but is that because they were super teams, or was it because Magic Johnson and Larry Bird were uniquely sort of marketable,
with an organic connection
between them?
Organic connection, race, all that stuff.
Right. Boston versus, East Coast, West Coast, white guy, black guy, Hollywood,
old rivalry reignited.
Boston. Like, there was, that wouldn't have been the same if it was the Pacers,
Bucks and Suns.
Right.
Yeah. There were certainly like factors there, but I just, it's, every era of growth that we have seen has been the foundation was laid by its star and the super team that star played on. And now we're going to this era where it's like, no, actually, have you seen the season that Jokic is having? And it's barely to get his team to the 7th seed right now. It's like, yeah, we have these great players. We have these talents that are putting up these insane individual lines and stuff like that. But because of the CBA, it's going to make it really, really difficult for them to actually play on a team that moves the needle outside of their market. And we saw how localization hurt baseball, and I think, making everybody a little bit mediocre.
And the economics of baseball as a league, pretty healthy.
Well, for one guy. For two guys,
for the whole league.
League's profitable.
Well, no, but
you go go put a baseball team up for sale, and see, that's why Fisher doesn't want to sell the thing. As crappy as an owner as he is, he'll take the thing to Sacramento and play in front of 14,000 people for 3 years while they build him a stadium in Las Vegas, because nobody wants to get rid of one of these things. They print money.
The league is also forcing him to pay up to get to the salary floor,
and he still won't. He's a terrible owner, but the point is, he's still holding on to the team. It's like, but again, I'll go back to my original point. Like, you kind of can't have it both ways. Like, you can't say that the league at the same time, all anybody cares about are trade rumors, and nobody cares about the regular season, and none of this stuff matters, and all we do is, it's a studio host league, and nobody cares about the games, and then get mad. Now, I think they need to tweak the CBA. I think what you guys were talking about before, like, okay, how can we incentivize keeping our own guys, but make it so you can still make a trade? It is too restrictive at the top now.
Yeah.
But you also, don't want 2 or 3 teams just gobbling up everything. I mean, some degree of dexterity ought to be required.
Also, too,
there's a middle ground. I think they'll find it. But
I also think one of the things that makes it also more difficult to maneuver, to be totally honest, is superstar salaries now are so big.
Yeah.
Like they're
even going up.
They're only going up. I know it's always been relative to a cap, but in terms of just finding salaries to add up to make these things, it's much easier to move a star player, like a legit star player, making $12 million a year. Back when I think that was roughly when Pau Gasol got acquired by the Lakers. I'll check this in real time, but I think he was making like 13 or 14 a year, 12, like something like that. Because Kwame Brown's expiring deal was only like $8 million, and that was the majority of the money.
Yeah.
It is much easier, even again, acknowledging the cap is all relative, to make those type of deals when you just have to add up to 12 as opposed to add up to 45.
That's why you see a lot of teams now, I think, signing those like Andrew Nembhard kind of deals of like 20 million or like 18 million, 20 million, 22. You need those slot. I think what's ultimately going to happen in teams like the Lakers, I am fascinated as to, especially if the current regime stays in power for a little while. And as Andy and I'd like to say, Rob Pelinka's got the hardest, easiest job in the world, because it's a really hard job, and it's like he's put himself in a really difficult position to try to fix it, except it's an easy job because apparently can't get fired. So in that sense, it's quite easy. But
Powell was making about 13.7, by the way, just
crazy.
For reference.
Right.
That's much easier to create a trade around.
It is. And I just think what is ultimately going to happen is teams, it's not just the superstar salaries are really, really high. I think what they're finding is the return on the superstar salaries at 50, 60, 70, when they're 33, 34, 35, 36 aren't high enough. And so you're going to see teams stop struggling more, maybe not about signing their own guys, but like Jimmy Butler becomes available, or Jimmy Butler's a free agent. He's got 3 years left. Zach LaVine is playing very well right now, and he's a relatively young guy. He's got an injury history and all this other stuff. But like from a player standpoint, the way he's playing right now, he could help a lot of teams, including the Lakers. But teams are really reticent to take on that money. And I think you're just going to see, and this is, I think, the idea, teams are going to be less comfortable giving full max extensions to James Harden going forward. Certainly if he's not already on your team, nobody's going to bring him in to do it. You might be the Clippers and be completely stuck and have to. But those kinds of deals, I think, are going to go. And they didn't do that with him. They didn't give him 4 years.
Yeah, it used to be if you were the best or second best player on your team, you got your max contract. It was just assumed. And I think now we're actually seeing negotiation there for for players who are not only the best or second best player on their team, but they aren't the top 10.
Harden got 2 in 70.
Yeah.
And he's not the James Harden of his prime, but he's still a pretty good player. He's a driving reason that team is above 500.
Yeah. We're seeing it with Brandon Ingram, right? Like Ingram is a very good player. He is either the best or second best player on that team. I would probably say best just because Zion is never healthy. And they're looking to trade him because they aren't going to give him his max, or they're going to negotiate a 2-year max rather than the full 4-year deal that you would just walk into the office and sign before. And we'll see how that turns out.
But to your previous point, like if that starts to become more the norm, 2 years, 35, even if it's 2 years, 100, 2 and 1, where for a guy who's 28, 29 years old, or whatever it might be, that should, if you can kind of loosen up a little bit of the restrictions at the top end, that actually should encourage movement, because nobody's going to be on the hook for super duper long.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have an opportunity to re-sign it. You can get good players ought to be moving around a little bit. I just think we're at a weird point right now where we're between two systems and people aren't calibrated. Very few teams seem like they saw this coming in a meaningful way and prepared their roster accordingly, including the Lakers, which is weird because they're usually really good at planning ahead for stuff like this. I'm surprised.
We were supposed to be talking about the names that could be attached to the Lakers here. So I'm guessing we'll do that on the second half of this home and home on your guys' show or whatever it is that you guys want to talk about. I do really quickly want to talk. We'll talk in more general sense. And if we have a little bit of time, we'll get to maybe some specific names. But I think first and foremost, because I see a whole bunch of, and what I'll probably do is I'll probably stick around and answer some of the starred comments after we're done here.
I can hang out a little bit. And Brian has to go earlier than me, but I can hang out a little bit after.
I also, sorry, Bill, I have a call here at noon, but I'll talk to you when I can. But like but yeah, I think the first thing that the Lakers, if the Lakers are going to get serious about movement at the deadline, moving as we approach the deadline, trade movement in general, first things first, they're going to have to open up some breathing room between them and the second apron. Not just because, ownership doesn't want to go into the second apron, but because of all of the things like we've mentioned over the course of this conversation that you cannot do in the second apron. Aggregating players is something that is kind of important in trades. And if you're above the second apron, you can't do that. I think first and foremost, whether it's making an imbalanced trade where you send out more money than you take in, or you send a Maxwell Lewis or one of your minimum guys or a couple of your minimum guys into some cap space or whatever, so that you can get, right now they have about $30,000 cap of space between them and the second apron. And that is just not nearly enough to be to be flexible enough to do what they want, I think, to do. Do you think though, because that just adds to the amount of capital it does to do anything in this trade market? Andy, do you think this team, like, not even taking into account what it would cost to get a Dorian Finney-Smith, a Cam Johnson, let alone a Jimmy Butler or a Zach LaVine, but on top of it, the extra cost of moving second round draft capital to give yourself the opportunity to be, flexible enough there. Do you think this team, as it's currently composed, is good enough to do all of that work for?
They're on the border. I think that you could talk yourself into doing it. But if you look at it objectively, they are, I think, somewhere between a solid to good team with an occasionally high ceiling and a floor that is lower at times than they need it to be. The other real issue, though, I think, and this is something I talk about all the time on Locked On Lakers and Lakers Talk and whatnot, as much as Rob Pelinka has made many mistakes since taking over basketball ops, were I Genie Bus, I would move on because I think the Lakers can do better, or at the very least, I would bring in more outside help for him, outside counsel, that sort of stuff. The one part of Rob's job that I think is legitimately difficult that people don't recognize enough is building around LeBron James at this stage of his career with the concessions that are required at LeBron's current price point. That is legitimately difficult. And we are seeing, as the years go on, even again, acknowledging the mistakes that Rob has to own, and however good you think Rob is or is not at doing this job, it is not easy to account for $49 million for a player that you're trying to take as much off his plate as possible for an entire season. The way energy has to be conserved almost entirely on the defensive end while playing 35 minutes a night. And even if you try to reduce his minutes, like, there's a baseline for how much you need LeBron on the floor just to make both the team work, but also you're starting to look to play him like 22, 24 minutes a night. Then why is he on this team? Like, at that point, he's basically, the Lakers in a lot of ways want to have LeBron operate as their second best player, like a high, 2A, while at the same time giving him the responsibilities of like your fourth best player in a perfect world. And that's very difficult to do at $49 million a year.
Yeah, they got to figure out a way to get him to be able. He's got to play 33 minutes a game, 32, 33, 34 minutes a game, and then. So I just think it's a question. We talked a lot about this for today's show. Like, how do you navigate? What was it? 7 games in 11 days that just finished, or 8 and 12? I forget what it was, but it was a lot, and it was a little bit more than normal. And like, even a guy like LeBron, you get used to, I'm sure, the every other day cadence of the NBA, the sort of normal every other day, wears on him more than it might wear on other players, but the body's used to it. It's when you start adding those 2 other games in that same stretch, or 3, on the back, like that's when it starts to, I think, really pile up in ways that he's like, like that's a little much. They have to figure out, they can't, I don't know how many more stretches like that they have this season, but they're going to have to manage those differently. And that's just how it is. And they're not good. I think Oklahoma City is good. They're not good. Like, Memphis, I think is good. Even like a team like Houston, Dallas, after kind of a shaky start, really seems to have gotten back into last year's form. If they didn't, obviously, but like, you could look at a negative 3.7 point differential with them 2 games over 500 and as an 8 seed. And if they had won the Atlanta game and won the Orlando game, you could say, oh, well, they're 15-9, and a 5 seed. I think that would make them. And yes, they would have basically the same negative point differential because they've gotten blown out of so many.
I was going to say, or if they just lose some of these games by 15 as opposed to like 41.
No, I'm just saying, win the game you lost. Win the game you lost by 1, and win the game you lost by 2. And it becomes just a very different conversation, because it's like, are you the team that has won some of these games, or you just, when you lose, you get throttled? But it doesn't really matter if you get beat by 4 or 40. Like, it's their depth is not good. And so I think, Anthony, I don't know if you have any ideas. I don't know how you can trade for better depth when you need to trade your depth.
They have all of their contracts, other than, I guess, maybe Gabe. Gabe Vincent's like a mid-sized contract, and I don't think he has a natural place on this team. But everybody else who is a mid-size-ish contract, whether you're talking about D'Lo, whether you're talking about Rui, a theoretically healthy Jared Vanderbilt, who for the time being I think is completely untradeable. Like, you're going to have to use all of your draft capital just to move Vando, forget the return. Yeah. But like, these are not expendable players. These are not, like, last year people looked at what Dallas did, and I saw a lot of Laker fans complaining, why didn't the Lakers just do that? Well, because everybody Dallas moved was either outside their rotation or Grant Williams, who they wanted the hell off that team. Like, they didn't move anybody who mattered. Like, D'Angelo Russell, for all of his flaws, and they are real, he matters on this team. And you can look at basically every single bit of data, lineup combinations, whatever. They are better when D'Lo's on the court. And I think a lot of it boils down to, nothing hurts this team more than having to defend in transition. Nobody on this team handles the ball more, certainly as a guard or a playmaker, while turning it over less than D'Lo. So he puts them in precarious situations, their worst situations, less than anybody on this team.
It's crazy to think about, though, because like, his turnovers, I think, freak out fans more than any others, because
they're so loud,
extremely loud. Exactly, like the one at the end of the half the other night, where that turned into that the last second 3-pointer, like, where he just sort of hucks the ball down the floor.
And D'Lo, everything D'Lo does will piss off Laker fans because he's been polarizing since the moment he entered the league. But like, you can't just move D'Lo like willy-nilly. Like, it matters. Like, he provides an important role in this team, particularly when Austin Reeves is a good player. He is not as good at the thing they want him to do, be a full-time point guard, as they've clearly set up the roster to be. The reality is they're trying to move D'Lo away from his strengths and Austin further from his
into
strengths.
those strengths.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, and both guys are more qualified to do the thing that the Lakers don't seem to want them to do. And I think it's in part because they love both the value and the story of Reeves. And I think they want to get as much credit as possible for Reeves and have that, be on the resume, as opposed to just use both guys the way they're best suited.
Yeah. Well, I had that question asked of me. I don't know if I got to it in yesterday's mailbag, but it was like, are the Lakers actually good enough to do the thing that you've been asking them to do with D'Lo all year, where like they're trying to wean themselves off of D'Lo? And it's like, clearly not, because I don't think, like you guys are talking about, it's a coincidence that he has the plus minus numbers.
We tried to tell you, Anthony.
Huh?
We tried to tell you.
I never
As
thought
real
that it would be
estate holders
easy.
on D'Lo Island, we tried.
Hey,
lonely ass island, man. It's just us.
quitting caffeine, quitting cigarettes, like that's a difficult thing to do. It's going to.
It was just supposed to be a 3-hour tour, but here we are. It's still.
Brian, you had mentioned that you got to get going, and Andy, if you want to take off too, I have to. I have some starred comments here that I'm going to answer, but if you guys want to hang out, cool. If not,
I'll hang out for a few and then I'll go.
All right. So we only have 3 of them.
Okay.
It does, however, mean that I get to play this thing, which I'm not sure you guys have heard on the show yet. That's my reward for the starred comments. Rye Guy starts us off with, the Lakers have to do something. Maybe Jimmy is what they need, purely from a man that F up cultural standpoint. They are embarrassing. Rob, man. The thing about Jimmy Butler is that, like, all right, if you bring him in to like impact your culture, he's coming from a place with inherent culture, and they're kicking him out if they trade him. So, like, I don't know if Jimmy is like the culture guy that they need. If any, the thing that he would bring is that he would call LeBron on his stuff, but I don't know. I don't see.
They might have to move
Butler's
LeBron to make this trade happen.
Like, I did get that. There's a comment in here. Just swap Jimmy for LeBron and see how it goes.
Can we just put a moratorium on acquiring players from Miami?
Yeah.
Just don't.
That's
don't.
A good call.
Don't
That's
do
a
it.
good
Just don't.
No.
It's sort of like, just don't. I mean, maybe it seems like a good idea. It's not a good idea. Don't do it. Just don't.
Do you guys think like Pat has like a button he presses on his guys and he's like, "Oh, you're going to the Lakers, huh?"
Chips that when you go to Miami, part of the culture is they put a chip in you.
Yeah.
And when you leave, they detonate the chip.
The next one here, also from Rye Guy, writes, let's say Miami accepts D'Lo, Rui, Hayes, Gabe, and a first, and a couple first swaps. You're not doing that if you're LA. That might be the best kind of deal Miami gets. For Jimmy Butler, I think they probably get more. I think they would certainly get more draft.
I'm not even sure you can do that, but like, we're given all that. Does that make the Lakers better?
D'Lo, Rui, Hayes, Gabe, and a first. I wouldn't miss Hayes. Wouldn't really miss. You can't. It's hard to trade both Gabe and D'Lo and not get a point guard back.
Correct. Even a forward like Jimmy who moves the ball well.
Yeah. I don't. Well, for one thing, I don't think Miami accepts that deal. I think they would get more than that for Jimmy Butler. And secondly, to your point, Brian, I don't know if that would move the needle. Now, that's the type of move I could see this front office making. Because they could, sell it as a needle mover, but I think that just, I guess
the other question you have to ask too is, do you want to be in the Jimmy Butler business long term? Because
at least next year
at like 52 mil or so, or extending Jimmy Butler.
Nobody's.
But you know what I'm saying? Like, you start getting into a situation where you are potentially moving a lot of capital for a 35-year-old guy with an injury history of his own. Like, in a perfect world, whoever you bring in, you need to feel confident they're going to be able to supplement the games that you might have to take off for LeBron or maybe even AD. It's like one of the reasons why when people bring up like wanting a backup big or another big and they bring up Robert Williams, I'm like, that makes no sense.
I mean, I would rather, if I have to do that deal, I would rather do something that comprehensive for Levine because he's 6 years younger.
Yeah.
And I don't want to do the Ingram deal.
Ingram, I think.
Oh, he's always hurt, though,
even though he's currently hurt. So
he's always hurt.
Yeah.
I love BI, but he's always hurt.
The last one here, Rye Guy also asks,
Dude,
LBJ
Rye Guy, you're going to buy a house off Rye Guy.
my guy, Rye Guy.
Dude,
LBJ
I
wants
don't
to
know what
help
Rye Guy
win,
does for a living. Like, where does he get all this disposable income?
You can just buy comments frivolously.
Take
Rye Guy's
lessons
making it
from
rain
25
over here. In the comment section.
He's buying lap dance comments over here.
Jeez, Rye Guy. Slow down.
Look,
Think of the children, Rye Guy.
Think of my children, you guys. Stop ruining this for me.
Fair point.
Uncle Rye Guy wants to know.
sending Miles to college. But no, so this was one of the things that I had kind of unearthed in because I wrote about the whole trade LeBron thing that has been a conversation started the last couple of days. And one of the things that I was kind of interested, or what I was intrigued to hear about, was how there are some people close to the Lakers who believe that LeBron was willing to take a pay cut this year. Maybe he opts out of his contract and he's open to do that go through all of that again potentially next year with a different crop of free agents. I have heard that he really, really, really wants to win a championship in LA with Bronny on the team. That's like the last thing that he that would be the last box that he would check off of his career, and he would ride off into the sunset as soon as that would be done. Is that something though that you can factor into any of the arithmetic that you would be doing if you trade for Jimmy Butler and LeBron's like, all right, you got me Jimmy Butler, I'll take a little bit less this upcoming offseason. Maybe it gives us some more breathing room after you get.
I feel like it's got to be a more significant. I mean, look, I'm not telling LeBron what to do with his money. I'm just saying in terms of making this math work, it's got to be a more significant and more flexible pay cut. Like the guys reportedly on LeBron's list from last year, and I've asked around about this, like it was
Clay,
from my understanding.
Harden,
But it was also like, these are the guys. Like, there's not really any wiggle room. It's these guys. James Harden was never a real possibility. Like, look at what he got offered from the Clippers. Like, that was not a thing. The Lakers certainly tried to overpay the hell out of Klay Thompson. It wasn't for a lack of effort, but the machinations for getting Klay to this team via sign and trade were always going to be super difficult, especially after we saw the Warriors didn't want to take back any money. They wanted to create an exception. And I'll be honest, from Valanciunas' perspective, if you just want to be playing and raise your market value for your next best contract, or you just like being on the court, the Wizards are, bad as they are, a better opportunity for him to play. Yeah. Like he's going to get less playing time with the Lakers, which is why I have no information about this whatsoever. I don't think it's impossible to believe that the reason the Lakers didn't give Valanciunas is Valanciunas preferred the Wizards situation for him to at least play. If LeBron is going to take a pay cut, it can't be, I'll take a pay cut for these three guys, and if we don't get them, I'm basically taking a full boat up to what keeps you under the second apron by $30,000. And I mean, again, I'm not being critical of LeBron. I'm just saying that is functionally not really a pay cut. Like in terms of how much it really helps the Lakers. He can take whatever money he wants. He's entitled to get what he can get. I'm just saying that's not really a thing.
Yeah, the Valanciunas thing, like from what I've been told, it was he was not comfortable waiting for the Klay decision. And given how money was drying up around free agency last year, I totally understand it. He took the money that he got in Washington, and the Lakers were content waiting for Klay, and they just struck out on Klay, and they wound up missing out on
it. Like they were trying to give Klay crazy money. Klay's fitting in nicely in Dallas. He's not setting the world on fire.
Yeah.
No, I mean, would you want to be on the hook for that if you're the Lakers? I mean, it's different if you're Dallas. You're a contending team. What on earth would the Lakers would be no better off with Klay Thompson now if they had Klay on the team. I don't think they really
not significantly better,
not materially
maybe better, but yeah, I don't know if it would be enough to pay somebody $20 million a year, for the Twilight.
The next four.
Yeah. That part.
$20 million this year. Fine.
Yeah.
I was on board with that.
Yeah.
4 and 8.
I think that the math that they were doing is that, the cap was going to be going up. So $20 million then won't hurt nearly as much as
Sure.
it would under this structure. But
It'll also be
it's just
60 at the,
guys, this has been an absolute blast. And I can't wait to do it again.
Yep.
Later this evening, I will be recording Locked On Lakers with you guys for the second part of this home and home thing. This joke has been bouncing around in my head, so I just have to tell it. If one of us drops out of like this and we are not able to do a home, would that make that person a home and home wrecker? Is that how that would go?
Not bad. Not bad.
On that note,
all right.
I'll allow it.
That's all for me.
Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Make somebody else's, and check out myself and the Kamenetzky brothers on Locked On Lakers a little bit later tonight. Have a good one, everybody.